Well, I'm happy to say that not just my assessment, but everybody's assessment about how this war was going to shake out has been wrong. The Ukrainians have outperformed by every possible measure. The Russians have underperformed by every possible measure. The Americans have gotten involved in a way that I don't think anyone thought was possible. And the Europeans, even almost to every single country, have gotten involved in a way that's helped keep Ukraine alive. This is still Russia's war to lose. And the challenges that Ukrainians are going to face in the second year are far greater than what they faced in the first, but they're still in the fight. And as long as it is still going on, a lot of the economic implications of the war have actually been deferred, and that's bought everybody a lot of time. Oh, it's absolutely winnable for the Russians. In fact, it should have been an easy carry. It should have been over months ago. But give you an idea of what's going on. When the first part of the war started, the Ukrainians had only had 8 years of preparation with a little bit of half-hearted help from the United States and the United Kingdom. And the rest of Europe kind of sat it out. They didn't have much of a military. Their economy was in shambles, had been for 30 years. And so the expectations that they would just collapse, were legitimate concerns. On the Russian side, you've got the second largest land army in the world, the third largest air force in the world, and more artillery than God. So it should have been a walk in the park. It hasn't been. But now that we're in the second year and it's no longer the David Goliath situation, we have a fundamentally different battlefront shaping up. On the Ukrainian side, they're getting more and more equipment from the West that's more and more advanced. And by the time we get to May, which is when they're going to be able to really get at each other once the ground firms up, the Ukrainians will have 60,000 new troops who have been trained across NATO countries coming in with a lot of the newer gear. And it's going to be a very mobile force trained to Western standards. It's going to be completely different from anything the former Soviet Union has ever seen. But the Russians are going to be into their second mobilization. When they started the war, there were 100,000 Russians in Ukraine. Now there's closer to 250,000. And by the time we get to May, it's probably going to be closer to 600,000. So for every tank the West has donated to Ukraine, the Russians are bellying up with an extra 5,000 troops. This is going to be a very, very different conflict. Everything you've identified is true. I mean, these soldiers are going to be badly equipped, badly led, with low morale and horrible logistics behind them, but there's still more than 500,000 of them. So, as Stalin was fond of saying, quantity is a quality all its own.
Mm.
And every single Russian war in history, the first year of it has looked like what we've seen. It's been a logistical disaster with high casualties. And then in the second year, they rally to the cause and they throw bodies at the problem until it goes away. And in about half of their wars, that works just fine. Privation is a Russian national pastime. So something like an economic recession or depression, which we really have not seen yet in Russia, is not going to slow them down at all. They have 70 years of Soviet legacy to burn through, 50 years of Soviet legacy to burn through. And yes, they're burning through it at a fast rate, but they've only recently really started to spin up their industrial complex, military industrial complex, excuse me. So I don't think they're going to run out anytime soon. Um, they discovered that the equipment that they were buying for the North Koreans wasn't all that, because artillery shells after a couple of decades kind of degrade, and the North Koreans were giving them the really old stuff. So that's probably tapped out. In the case of Iran, Iran is not capable of mass production of their suicide drones. So the discussion now is to build a facility within Russia that can mass manufacture Iranian technology, which is just hilarious to say that out loud. But that's where we are. The big question is China. Now, in a sane universe where China is interested in its national and economic survival and success, the Chinese wouldn't even consider this. But that's not the world we're in. Chairman Xi has so purged the Chinese system of anyone who's capable of conscious thought that it is now just him. And in a cult of personality governing system, all it takes is some dumbass bureaucrat to think that doing this will stick it to the United States' eye, and so that is what the great leader wants, and to send a few cargoes of weapons. And I'm very concerned that that's exactly what's going to happen this year. That without any approval from Xi, someone within the
Mm.
bureaucracy is going to take this inflammatory action and force then the United States to do things. And that's exactly what we saw with the balloon fiasco. Here there's a balloon that's 350 feet across, dangling something the size of an Embraer jet that you can see with the naked eye. And it completely torched bilateral relations And it was the intelligence find of the decade for the United States because we basically flew a spy plane over it and a spy helicopter under it for 9 days and got more information on Chinese capabilities and routing and cryptography than we had in the last decade. But some idiot in the Intelligence Bureau thought it was a good idea. I'm afraid we're going to see that kind of miscalculation 4 years on, that warrior wolf diplomacy was perhaps the dumbest thing in the history of their country. And China's been around for a long time, so that's a really hot statement. But they realize now that there is no technological future. Biden has killed that. There is no energy future because the Russians are killing that. And there is no financial future because they have killed that themselves with their housing market. They realize that their whole system now is teetering on the edge. And the question is, what's going to push it over? And they really, really need to ratchet it down if they're going to have a chance here. Because if the Americans are not part of the solution, there is no solution for them. We control the sea lanes. We control the energy in the agricultural markets. We're their largest consumer base. We're the source of most of their technology. They have to have a relationship. But they had come to that conclusion. And then the balloon fiasco happened. So the ability of the decision-making apparatus in China to make basic functionality of the system, that's now gone. And all that's left is press releases. So most Russian crude that is in Western Siberia is produced in the permafrost. And so if there's any appreciable takedown of takeaway capacity because of boycotts or sanctions or whatever else, the pressure builds back up in the wells until you get to the permafrost and the wells freeze shut. The water that comes up as a byproduct of oil production turns into ice. And when water freezes into ice, it expands and it pops the pipes. We know this because it happened in 1992 and it took the fields offline for 30 years. Now, in Russia, to this point, that has not happened because they do have a little bit of a swing production. There's about 1 million barrels a day in the western part of the country that is not in permafrost. And that they can turn off and on. Now, when I had spoke to you a year ago, that 1 million barrels a day had already gone offline. And like the next incremental barrel was in the danger zone. But the Europeans designed their sanctions specifically to allow crude to keep flowing. They're trying to reduce Russia's money, but they're not trying to destroy themselves. So they want to give themselves time to wean themselves off. And so a couple of weeks after I spoke with you, they started bringing that 1 million barrels a day of swing production back online, and they've never gotten to that threshold again until now. Now probably 700 to 800,000 of that swing is offline again. And we're now in an environment where every reinsurance company in the world has said we're not going to insure any Russian vessels whatsoever. So the danger is still there. And with the insurance now coming from Indian and Chinese and Russian government entities that have never offered maritime insurance before, all it's going to take is one incident somewhere for us to get back to that scenario, but it hasn't happened yet. That's oil. Natural gas is actually simpler. The Nord Stream pipeline is gone. That was the single largest trunk line for natural gas transport in the world. And it was 40% of Germany's total demand. And when it went offline, we saw natural gas prices in Germany rise by roughly a factor of 8. Now, if you look at natural gas prices today, you will notice that they're pretty low, but 3 things have happened that are not sustainable. Number one, temperatures in Europe have been 30 degrees above average for almost 8 weeks, historically unprecedented. So demand is lower on the consumer side. Second, China was in lockdown for most of that period and still hasn't spun up all the way. So global demand for liquefied natural gas has been low. But third and most importantly,